Thank you. In that case, I'll start with Treasury and then I'll move back to the ATO, just in case it is Ms Wilkinson who needs to assist me with my questions to Treasury. I'm interested in Treasury's view of Victoria's likely economic performance as a result of the stage 4 restrictions that have been entered into. What work has Treasury done on the likely economic impact of those restrictions?
Thank you, Senator. Happy to speak to that issue, and I think the Prime Minister and Treasurer have made some public remarks in this regard. Clearly, the difference between, by moving from stage 3 to stage 4 restrictions, it's as people are aware, a much stricter set of restrictions and therefore a much more severe economic impact on Victoria. Obviously, that's got to be traded off with the health benefits of these measures. Treasury, as you would be aware, Senator, in the July economic update, provided some preliminary estimates of the impact of the Victorian stage 3 restrictions that were imposed at the time. And our estimate at the time was that would reduce national GDP in the September quarter by about just over $3 billion and take 3/4 of a percentage point off growth in that quarter. With the implementation of the stage 4 restrictions in Victoria and the application of stage 3 restrictions to regional communities as well, we had a look at what we thought, from a preliminary sense, what that may do to the economic activity in Victoria and nationally. And I stress it's preliminary analysis, but our preliminary analysis was that this would, the additional restrictions would reduce real GDP by a further $7 to $9 billion. And when you add those together, the full stage 3 and stage 4 restrictions combined, that would mean the September quarter economic activity would be down by about $10 to $12 billion at the national level, which is around 2.5 percentage points from quarterly real GDP growth in that quarter. And we estimated that the effect of the additional stage 4 restrictions on employment, on effective employment, would mean that essentially between 250,000 and 400,000 Victorians would essentially be out of work compared with previous stage 3 restrictions. And that includes people who are essentially stood down on 0 hours as well.
Thank you. So just for clarity, those total figures, the $10 to $12 billion for the national economy, that captures both the direct impact in Victoria of tougher restrictions, but also the impact on other states of Victoria's restrictions, which I imagine includes trade between Victoria and other states, but also the impact on sentiment in other states?
Correct, Senator. So our estimate was, of that estimate, we considered that around 80% of that economic cost would be borne directly in Victoria, and that around 20% was that those broader confidence and trade-related effects that you've described. I would stress that in the Victorian case, we have some evidence from international experience and from the original implementation of restrictions. So while we're not necessarily, it's difficult to be confident in this world on any figure, but the Victorian impacts, we have something to go off. For those additional confidence effects across the rest of the country, they're much harder to predict. And so I think from our perspective, that number is one that we'll keep under review as we go forward, depending on how things play out in Victoria and other states.
There was a release of some employment data this week, but I just want to clarify my understanding of that only applied to early July. So it predated the reintroduction of stage 3, let alone the stage 4 restrictions in Victoria. Is that right?
I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Power, to speak to this. It certainly did not pick up the reimposition of the imposition of stage 4 restrictions and those broader regional restrictions. I'll ask my colleague just to confirm. It may have picked up some of the stage 3.
Yeah, so that's right. So, Senator, the reference period is the first 2 weeks of July. The stage 3 restrictions in Victoria did actually commence around the 8th of July, so there's a small component that we're probably seeing in that release. But as you're probably aware, there was actually still some quite strong numbers coming out of Victoria in there. So actually probably only slightly impacted, and expect next month to show some of that impact.
Yeah, well, that was what I was going to get at, because it looked like, pleasingly from a Victorian point of view, that Victoria had rebounded amongst the strongest of any states from the easing of restrictions. I guess, unfortunately, that means that Victoria is likely to, in the next data series, suffer even more proportionately from a loss of employment. Is that a fair assumption?
I think, Senator, just as context, we have, I suppose, been I won't say surprised, but the numbers that have been coming out in recent months for employment have shown that with the easing of restrictions, there was a substantial rebound in both employment and people coming back into the labour market, which is perhaps a little stronger than we had been expecting. Of course, great amount of uncertainty in this time, but we had seen quite a strong rebound in employment, and particularly in those sectors that were heavily affected by restrictions such as retail and food services. But you are right that Victoria was one of the stronger states in the most recent data, and we would certainly be expecting a very significant hit to Victorian employment in the next monthly figures.
Yeah. Just on that, finally on the employment figures, the Victorian Treasurer Tim Pallas said before a parliamentary inquiry this week that he believes that unemployment will reach 11% in Victoria, will peak at 11% in Victoria, I think around Christmas time. Is that consistent with your forecasts and expectations?
We don't forecast state by state unemployment rates per se. I think the Prime Minister has made comments in the public domain that we now think that the peak in the unemployment rate, purely based on the additional restrictions in Victoria, would lift that peak from around 9.25% in December this year to closer to 10%, and you would expect that Victoria would have a relatively higher share. I think the employment numbers I cited are also quite consistent with those that Premier Andrews has referred to, which I think was around 250,000 Victorians. So I think certainly the kind of figures you're discussing, Senator, are not out of the range that we would consider plausible.
Okay. All right, thank you. I'm conscious Ms Wilkinson needs to go, and in any case, I didn't need her for that bracket.
She does. Ms
can I move?
Are you happy to? You go now. Yeah.
Can I move back to the ATO now, just briefly? Mr Hirshon, I was listening with interest to your evidence in response to Senator Keneally's questions about the eligibility for people who'd made withdrawals under the early access schemes. Particularly, and I just want to make sure I got my understanding right and I heard you correctly, because there's been a lot of speculation, at least in the media, that there's widespread ineligibility in terms of access. But you said of that sample that you did, 90% were clearly eligible, is that right?
Yeah, so across the population as a whole, so this is all applicants, 90% by just data matching against other sources were eligible.
All right, so that wasn't a sample, that was the whole...
But that was the population.
4 million.
And then we did a pilot review against, in a sense, the 10%, which weren't clearly eligible.
Yep. Okay, so to clarify, the 90% figure comes from all applicants up to a certain date, and the 10% was the sample. Then
against the 10%, we have chosen subpopulations to do pilot compliance exercises. And on our first pilot, which was of 130, we managed, 160, I think, we managed to successfully contact about half. And of the half we did contact, most were actually, 90% were actually eligible.
Yeah, so I just want to understand that sample of the 10%, the 160, was that a random sample?
Yes, so that was I suppose, can I say random-ish?
Yeah, okay, yeah. For the purposes of this exercise. So 90% clearly eligible. Of the 10% sample that you had concerns about, a further 90% that were able to be contacted were also eligible. So we're looking at, but as you know, there were some that didn't respond. So we're looking at the vast majority of people who've accessing it appear to be eligible.
Oh yeah, so I'm not sure, I'm not sure as of today that I can say whether that's, where in the 90% that is, but it's possible that it's in the mid to high 90% eligibility.
Great, okay. And you are now doing a more risk-based sample, is that right? So people that you think are a higher chance of being ineligible?
Yes, so we're now doing a pilot based on groups that we think are more likely to be ineligible.
Yeah.
And then from that to try to get a sense of, again, we might prove that even in that sample there's high degree of false positives. But at this stage, no program is 100% correct. I'm actually very comforted by the numbers that are coming through.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my follow-up, I guess, final question is, how would you assess this program against other programs where taxpayers effectively self-assess their eligibility? How does it compare for its compliance?
Yeah, so again, we're at early days, but if I refer back to our overall measurement of tax system performance, which is a self-assessment system, and what we sometimes call our tax gap analysis, our estimate of the overall Australian tax system is that it runs at about 92% tax performance, and that is a global high, or that's a very high level globally. Even if those, could I say, not every country publishes tax gaps, because you've got to be pretty brave as a tax authority to publish them. Only the confident and competent countries publish them. But a self-assessment system running at 92% is, for a tax system, is very high. I think it'll turn out that the performance on this scheme is significantly higher than that.
Wow, okay. Well, that is great news,
Senator
because there's certainly been a
Paterson,
lot of speculation to the contrary. Thank you,
You've
Chair.
taken your